All right, let's come together. I hope that ringing out is not too loud on the recording. But we do have 3 lectures to get through today, so I'm hoping that we can get through it in relatively short order. So we just finished talking about Ancova, and we went into depth about sums of squares of errors and how Ancova generally works. So now we're going to talk about Ancova. Ancova is not just a single analytical tool, it's actually a whole family. There's Ancova, there's Ancova, there's Manova, there's Mancova, then there's factorial Ancovas, there's a whole bunch of different things. We're going to cover only 3, Ancova, Ancova, and then factorial Ancova. If you want to look into other ones, I invite you to explore the textbook further or consult things online. This should give you a base understanding of how to work with these tools. And for your assignment 4, if you choose to use Ancova, you can use anything in the family. So if you want to do a Manova, if you want to do a really sophisticated factorial Ancova, that's great. You don't have to. Okay. So Ancova is the catchy name for the analysis of covariance, as opposed to analysis of variance. And what it means is you've got a predictor variable that's expected to be correlated to the output variable. So, what does this look like?
What slide are you on, sir?
Slide, is that 40?
Yeah.
Wow, that is, oh, wow, ha, ha. Thank you, I didn't start at the beginning. Ha. We'll get to Ancova in a second. But that's what Ancova ends up being with a covariate. Thank you for catching that. That was a mistake. Okay, let's try again. By the end of this lecture, you'll be able to describe planned contrasts and recommend them, and then versus a post-hoc analysis, and then plan, run, and conclude an Ancova in R. My apologies. We'll start again. So Ancova, we got our jelly bean problem, right? They find an effect, and that's due to the family-wise error rate. So we control it. So there's 2 things. How do you control the family-wise error rate? You either control the rate using something like Bonferroni's correction. There are other types of correction, like Tukey's. Usually that relies upon you having an Ancova to begin with. And the other thing is you compare everything at once, compare all the means, and you get the sums of squared this way right here. And this allows us to, we talked about Bonferroni correction. And So as I mentioned last time, Bonferroni correction is very conservative, especially if you're making lots of comparisons. It's sort of a worst case control if you're really afraid of controlling the family-wise error rate and you do lots of comparisons. You can use Bonferroni correction. You will control the family-wise error rate, but you might not find your effects. You might over-adjust them. So when you're doing multiple comparisons, so we use Bonferroni correction, but there's other methods, we've already talked about them, for handling multiple comparisons. There's Bonferroni correction, there's Tukey's, honestly significant difference, there's Dunn, and then there's Chaffee's methods, there's a couple other ones that I think are around. It really depends on how many tests you're doing, how conservative you want to be. Dunn's was one that you'd seen before? Yeah. Excellent. And what contrast you use. Okay. So Tukey's HSD is great when you're testing all pairwise comparisons because it only controls for that many comparisons, right? What was Dunn good for? What do you remember about Dunn correction?
We used to take the difference of means, and then I don't exactly remember the problem.
Okay. Dunn's is non-parametric, so it's kind of convenient in that way in case you have some weird distributions. Chaffee's looks at all possible contrasts. So if you're like lumping different means together, it's very good. So you can choose whichever method is best for you. Often Tukey's HSD is good. But wait a second, what are contrasts? We've talked about them, but we didn't talk about them really in depth. So here's where we talk about something called planned contrasts. And this is very, very helpful if you're planning experiments, which is, again, how I often use these kinds of tools. So post hoc analysis is common and reflects an attitude of, we found an effect, now where is it? We know that dose is effective, but we don't know where that is, right? This is kind of like data mining rather than running an experiment. Another way, if you have a specific hypothesis in your data, is to use something called planned contrasts. I'll point you to the textbook for detail, but to give you a sense of this, we'll dive into this. Wait, how have we seen this before? Can anyone remember us talking about contrasts?
Yep.
Yep.
We know there is a specific relationship between some predictors. We
Yep.
want to check whether this is true or not.
Okay, yes. Exactly, there's like relationships or structure in the different means that we construct. Who here has done planned contrasts before? Okay, a couple of people. Who has done like post hoc analysis, like Tukey's or Bonferré correction, et cetera? It's not a lot of people. Okay. So remember when we talked about dummy variables, okay? We had our crusties, our no musical affiliations, our indies, and our meddlers, right? And we had to do all of this stuff to get these really nice contrasts, right? So we had our default, which was nothing. And then we had our crusty, which is the mean of the crusty, indie kid, which is the indie, meddler, which is the meddle. People who said that they're meddlers, right? Boom, boom, boom. So these are things that are called contrasts. Planned contrasts are contrasts that you plan in advance before you do your experiment, before you even collect your data often. So it's comparing combinations of factor levels that are chosen before you run your experiment. It's the more principled way of doing post hoc analysis. It's not called post hoc analysis. It's the most principled way of looking at analyzing the results of your ANOVA without just saying, oh, there is an effect, but we don't know where it is. If you don't know where effects are, post hoc techniques are fine, and that's where you do your Bonferroni or your Tukey's or Dunn's or Chaffe's, right, depending on what you're analyzing. So, if we separate the dummy variables, and we sometimes just kind of sweep them under the rug, in this case we have the placebo, which is our intercept, that's our default option, low dose, and then high dose. Remember, these are dummy variables or indicator variables or one-hot encoding. A contrast, on the other hand, might look at, is there a difference between some dose and a placebo, right? So any sort of experimental group in the placebo. And then the second might be low dose versus high dose. So we may want to ask those questions, right? Does adding the drug of any sort increase the effects over the placebo? And does having a low dose change compared to a high dose, right? And this is where we really have to understand the structure of our experiment. So this will be if you're supporting a psychologist or a biostatistician or someone who's doing an analysis for an experiment. So the contrasts, in this case, what you do is you basically sum up versions of these. So you take the low and the high, and then you have to contrast them with placebo. But because we have two means, we have one low, one high, that means we have to double the placebo's mean to see if those are equivalent or not. So basically you're seeing if the mean of the placebo, which is just the placebo, is compared to the mean of the low and the high. And you kind of scale it up. Instead of taking the mean of these two, you just add those two, and you double the placebo, and you compare those two. What would the contrast be? What would contrast 2 be on this slide for comparing the low and the high dose? Talk to your neighbor for 30 seconds and see if you can make a guess. Go.
Oh, contrast 2. Contrast 2 it doesn't high low and low dose with no
– 5 seconds.
Because contrast 2 you're comparing low dose versus high dose.
All right. Who has a guess at what contrast 2 should be? What numbers we put there? Yep.
0, 1, minus 1, or 0, minus 1.
Exactly. Yeah. We're comparing the low and the high dose. We don't care about placebo. we just want low and high. And since we just have one of each, we just have 1 and -1. So, bingo. Did anyone else get that as their guess? Does anyone seem confused by this result?
I have a question about contrast 1.
Yep.
The placebo -2, is that the double
Yep.
already of the -1?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Exactly, because they have to sum to 0. Because when you're adding this together, because what the contrast ends up doing is testing does the sums combined in this way sum to 0? And so you're basically doing a linear combination. You're adding all these means together and seeing if they add up to 0 and thus are the same. And if they don't, then that's your null hypothesis. Yep.
Can we also have the possibility of a contrast where the high and low dose are not taken into consideration and just the placebo effect? I mean, just the placebo rate?
Short answer, no, because you're not contrasting anything. You have to have at least 2 levels. Like what would you?
Have levels for that.
You have to have 2 different levels. Yeah. Because like what question could you ask that's like, is the placebo different from?
If placebo was also a level variable, like in that case.
Well, is it? Oh, if there's 2 placebos.
Yeah.
Yes, if you had placebo 1 and placebo 2, you could then do. Yeah. Okay. Actually, I could draw this out. Would that be a useful thing to do, or? Yeah, okay, yeah, let's do that. So let's assume there's 2 placebos. There's like sugar and salt, I guess, would be 2 different placebos, maybe. We'll go to the board for this. I think, I find it's useful to go in depth rather than try to speed through the slides, and I feel like everyone's on the same page there, so we're going to do that. So let's imagine you've got, okay, so this is total. And these are sums of squares, by the way. So you got this subsquare, and you kind of slice them up. So this would be placebo. This would be treatment. And then we have low, and then we have high. And you know what? Actually, let's do low and high. So let's say there's a little bit of placebo, and then there's a high placebo. Okay? So, what are some contrast? Can people see this, by the way? Yeah? Okay. Okay, so what questions can we ask about this structure? And we'll write these out. So we got placebo, then we got low, we got high, and then we got, I guess, treatment or dose. It's such a treat to have medicine. I guess in this case it's Viagra, so we're not going to go there whether it's a treat or not. These are our contrasts. So, what are some contrasts that we could have, and what would they ask? Any ideas?
You can ask if any treatment is better than placebo 1 or 2.
Yep, okay, so we're going to compare placebos to treatment. What would that be?
-1, 1,
Yeah. Well, it'll be
Not quite. That's a different question. We'll do that in a second.
-1, -1, 1.
Yeah. Yeah, it's sum to 0, remember, because that's what we're checking. And so we see that this is treatment versus placebo, and we put all the means that we care about. Well, let's simply, what else could we ask? Sorry? Between treatment? Like between high and low dose?
Like we had
Okay. Okay, what would that be?
0, 0,
0, 0,
-1,
Yep. 0, 0, -1, 1. What else could we ask?
below 0, 0, and then placebo will have this and -1.
Yep. So I'll do -1, 1 again. So that's the difference between low and placebo. And I would expect there's no difference because it's a placebo, but if there is, then uh-oh.
Is there a difference between
Low placebo and low treatment.
Yeah, how would you do that?
-1, 0, 1, and 0.
-1, 0, 1, 0. Yeah, I think we get it, yeah? Now this one, I have a hard time understanding the theoretical basis of it, but you could do it. So this is where you have your theory, right? You're asking questions to be able to figure it out. Yep.
I don't understand what is that? Is that the coefficient? What is it?
Oh yeah, okay, so what you're doing to calculate these things, can't remember if it's in the slides or not. So let's say this is a libido of, I don't know, like the mean is 32 and the mean here is 34. And then the treatment low, let's say that's 56, and then the high is like 72, right? So those are the means that we calculate. And what you're doing is you're summing these up. So the first one would be, so the -1 times 32 plus -1 times 34 plus 1 times 56 plus 1 times 72. And then you sum those things up. And if we add those up, we're going to have something that's higher than 0. And we check, we basically do like a statistical test. I can't remember if it's a t-test or an Ancova. But we check, I think it's a t-test maybe. Don't quote me on that. I forget how to judge. I haven't done this by hand in a while. We basically sum this up. We get a result. That result would be something like, I guess it would be -66, 128, 62. 52? 62, right? Am I right? And then what we do is we test, does this equal 0? And if it does not equal 0, if it's above 0, which it is, but that, when you compare the noise, if it's significantly different than 0, then you conclude that treatment is higher than the placebo for libido. And the same comes here. So over this one, you'd say 56 versus 72. And sum those up. So the difference is, 16? So you check to see if 16 is equal to 0 or not. And the same over there, right? So this way you can do any combination of factors, and you check to see if there's a difference or not.
So basically, whether it's a positive or a negative,
Yeah.
you decide which is higher.
Yeah. So for the banks, I would say in this case, treatment is something like 66, and depending on the error, right? Because this is the variance explained by the model. We're actually slicing it up to be these different levels. Then we have our error term. So what you do is you use that error term to do a test, right? Actually, I think it is an F test. Now that I think about it, you might find out. You then do that test to see if given that ratio of that error, is it greater than 0 or not, or is it like, is it bigger than error? If it is, then we would probably conclude yes, treatment is effective. It is significantly different from placebo, but we might not conclude that lower high dose are different. We may not conclude that placebos are different. Right? Cool. Okay. Okay. So you use these weights to calculate differences between the means of the groups. But there are rules to contrasts. Specifically, the weights must sum to 0, as you see, because we're just adding them up and seeing if it equals 0 or not. The contrasts must be less than or equal to the number of groups. So in that case, we couldn't add any more contrasts. You can only have up to 4, because otherwise you just run out of degrees of freedom. And the big thing is they have to be orthogonal. Otherwise, there will be bias. So what it means is you have to multiply them together and see if those sum to 0 as well. Okay? So, there. You do that for, I think, every combination of contrasts. If they're all orthogonal, you're good. It just sliced up the variance, and you can just proceed. If they're not orthogonal, I think there's ways to correct it, but I just always try for orthogonal. And with a nice structure like this, you can usually get it.
If it's not orthogonal, does it mean it's not independent?
I don't know. Orthogonal in this case, it doesn't quite mean, it's not like two variables are independent or not. It's a different orthogonal in that.
Even
So,
the levels and factors that we consider.
it's not related to that. What it does mean is that, for example, these three are orthogonal. This one's not orthogonal. I cannot remember what it means in the math. I'm sorry. I'll try and answer that on campus tomorrow. If that's useful. Okay? Okay. Was there another question? Yeah. How are the weights? You determine those, right? Because they have to sum to 0. So in this case, to compare placebo to low and high, all three of those need to sum to 0. You have to have at least one for low and high to include them. So you have to have -2 to balance it out. If there was low, medium, and high in the treatment, and only one placebo, you'd have 1, 1, 1, and then you have a -3 at the top. Sorry, say again?
Can we have a decimal base?
It could be -4 and +2. Plus, like
I can take 0.25 for low and high, and I can have -0.5 for.
yeah, you can do that. I think typically they're integers. But yeah, you can have -4, 2, 2. That's fine too. That would be equivalent. You would have exactly the same outcome. Yeah.
So a follow-up to that question,
Yep.
if we put low equals 1 and high equals 2, we could
Yep.
still get to 0 by putting placebo as -3, but then we're weighting the low and high differently, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
And that you'd have to have a theoretical reason for that.
Okay,
And it's going to be a lot harder to make it orthogonal.
right.
Okay. So imagine something like, but this is exactly what you just suggested, right? So we have this version here. Contrast 1 might be control versus experimental groups. So here's -3, 1, 1, 1. And then we want to compare E1 and E2. So then we have the control is 0, because we're ignoring it. We control E1 and E2 together, and then we have -2 at the bottom. And contrast 3 is between these two, and we have that. And if we check, I believe these are all orthogonal. Yep. So that's all good. Yep. So then this is excellent. So the way you do this in R is you type them in, and you have contrasts of the data, of the variable, and you kind of put them in. They're now an attribute of that variable. And so analysis of variance knows how to use this. So then if you run AOV, again, we want to rename our values, dose versus no dose, high versus low. And then if we do this, we actually have outcomes here. And what do we conclude from this?
The same thing we did previously.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we do. We can go through each of these. First of all, this just means that on average, with the default values of everything else, there's a libido score that's probably higher than 0. Did I just get an alert? Nah. We see that dose versus no dose has an effect, but dose high versus low does not have an effect. But because they are orthogonal, we don't have, all this is controlled by the family-wise error rate. Okay, so the way this works, you have your hypothesis, and you plan contrasts, and then you run your ANOVA. If not, you run your ANOVA, and then you do, if for anything that's not handled by the contrast, you do post hoc analysis. That's your Bonferroni, your Tukey's, your Dunn, your Chaffe's. Okay? And that's how you do your ANOVAs. So if you want to kind of have a theoretical question, do the contrasts. You just want to see if there's a difference to see what happened, post hoc analysis. If you're going to compare every pairwise group, you just do Tukey's HSD as your post hoc analysis, and that's automatically contrasts of like 1 minus 1 for every pairwise combination, which ends up being orthogonal. So you're good. And if you do Chaffet's, it's every conceivable contrast is all controlled. So you can look at any of them, which is kind of nice. Okay, questions? Yep. Over there and then here.
Like when you are doing the contrast, applying the contrast, the doses were actually from the results of experimental group, and placebo is the result of control group. So like there is a like it's mentioned there that the doses are the results of experimental group and the placebo is from control group. So will that add any kind of bias in the results we get? Because control group is somewhere there will be some kind of control from the experimenter, so that there can be values change according to the test being made. But in experimental group, we may not have that feasibility. So
I don't quite understand your point. You're saying there's bias because you have a control group?
yeah, like so it's mentioned like experimental versus control group. So will there be any bias in our outcomes?
Why would there be bias?
Because it's mentioned there. I'm not sure. I'm just asking.
I don't understand your question. I'm sorry.
Like when you're planning the contrast,
Yeah.
it's mentioned that experimental group results and control group results.
Is that on a different slide?
Yeah.
Like here? Like this?
There.
Yeah. So the contrast needs to be orthogonal.
They mentioned the experimental groups and control groups in the contrast one.
Sorry?
In the chart, in the chart, in the second stage.
The second stage? So, it's like down here?
In this chart only, in the
Contrast 2, I think he's talking about. Why is there no placebo?
in the contrast one.
Okay, contrast 1. Yeah.
The placebo is variance explained by control group, and here we have experimental groups.
Yeah, so the placebo is the control, right? It means that it's not an experimental group. Like if you're administering a medicine, you might have a placebo, which is like a sugar tablet. So people think that they're taking the medicine, but they're not. And usually this would be like a double-blind, experiment. And then you have 2 experimental groups, and then those have different dosages. So this might be the way that you look at studying a medicine, right?
So we are controlling the placebo.
The placebo is the control. Instead of giving you Viagra, we're giving you a sugar.
Okay.
And so we expect sugar probably doesn't have an effect. Or ideally, we pick something that we know wouldn't have an effect on the outcome variable, which here would be some measure of libido. So we have 2 different dosages of the actual medicine, and we have 1 dose that's just like makes you think you're taking the tablet. And then you might be able to look at whether that's equal to 0 or not. Like that's a separate thing we could check, maybe. Or you could give no placebo. Like maybe there's 2 control groups. One is no placebo, one is with a placebo. And you can see if the placebo effect has an effect. And that's kind of what we have up there. Okay? Does that help answer your question? Okay. There's another question, right? Okay. Cool. There's your orthogonality. Yep. Yep.
I didn't understand why we did this in the first place. So I understood the point of Ancova.
Yeah.
You're checking 3 things, for example, or multiple things,
Yeah.
and seeing if they're the same. Why are we doing this?
The contrasts?
Yeah. What's the point?
The point is that you can do all of these tests simultaneously. So here we're checking, last time we had to do all that Bonferroni correction and all that, but it's not very, it's very conservative, so you might not find an effect. And if you do like 20 comparisons. But here, if you have a structure, you can do this. It's principled because you've set everything out beforehand. So this is a little bit of an experimental design lecture rather than just a purely statistics lecture. So you're planning everything in advance, which is a bit more principled because it means you're not going to p-hack, right? So It's showing that you're not p-hacking because you planned everything in advance. The second thing is that it basically, when you do your ANOVA, it checks, instead of looking at whether the variable has an effect, it checks your contrasts. And so you can ask multiple questions, and quite complex questions depending on your structure, simultaneously controlling the family-wise error rate. So what this is saying, so what plan contrast gets you, or what contrasts get you, is more sophisticated questions or more complex questions can be answered than just, does this variable have an effect? It's, is there a difference between these two groups and these two groups and these two groups and these two groups, and you can answer all of that in various combinations using the ANOVA. Make sense? Cool. Okay. Any other questions before we move on to Ancova? This is going to be a very full lecture, by the way, I'm realizing, because we're cramming 3 topics, and we haven't talked about ANOVA like at all. So I hope it's going to be okay. Yeah?
Summary of that ANOVA test in the previous slide.
What about it?
In the summary, in the intercept, so it's like can we interpret like it, even without any load, it's just a placebo that making some statistical difference on the zero?
No, I wouldn't say that. No, what it means is across all these groups, like in the data, if you have no predictive variables, the average libido that would be measured is above 0. Which means that the way you might interpret is that everyone has libido. Or at least, or more accurately, if you're measuring this, I don't know how you're measuring libido. I don't want to know how you're measuring libido. But however you're measuring it, whatever that measure is, you're measuring a baseline. So same for like anxiety for the spiders. Everyone, even if they're like the most chill person that you've ever met, might score 20 or more, like might have some value that's non-zero on the anxiety questionnaire because they're completing the questionnaire, and so their score is between 1 and 100. And so with libido, maybe it varies between 1 and 100, and everyone's like, it just means that the average is not equal to 0. So all that's saying is that whatever your outcome variable is, and the default of everything is just, like the grand mean is different than 0. It's kind of what it's saying. And so sometimes you interpret the intercept, sometimes you don't. In this case, it just means that your metric means that everyone, like people are reporting libidos on the measure. But that's meaningless unless you know what the measurement is and whether that matters. Because on the score, like, I assume everyone's going to score something just by existing, right? Like, yeah.
By doing the contrast, the multiple R squares, like, what is that interpretation? That's 46%, additional 46% of results? But like, because by doing the contrast, you are essentially, you have all of the scenarios, right?
Yeah, so what the contrasts are doing, if they're orthogonal, so you have your treatment and your error, you have your model and your error. What contrast is doing is it's basically taking, and I'll wait for everyone to look because I'm going to do something here. You got your model, right? This is your explained variance. Your contrast is basically slicing this up. And this would be contrast 1, contrast 2, contrast 3. Okay? So it's just slicing up your explained variance into different contrasts and checking that. And I haven't looked at the math in a long time with this, but that's kind of what it does. If they're not orthogonal, it ends up being kind of exaggerated, like it ends up being bigger than the sum of its parts. So if it's orthogonal, you're at least slicing it up in a way that makes sense. Okay?
Okay.
Yeah. And that's why you can't have too many things either, because then it starts to go into the error.
So can we have interpretation of the multiple R squares or not really?
Yes, yeah. I think the multiple R squared is like how much the variance you're overall explaining. Yeah.
But for all of the contrasts, like just
Yeah, collectively the model is explaining that. Yeah.
model. Okay, so that is still the collective model.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure.
Not
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
specific treatment.
Yeah. Exactly. So what it's doing is, yes, it's what this is really doing is taking one variable, and now we're actually able to, instead of just looking at the different independent levels of the variable, we're restructuring. What we're doing is we're taking the model, so the dose level, and we're just like shuffling around that. We're kind of explaining different pieces of it. So instead of it just being like there's placebo, low, and high, we're saying there's this difference and this difference, and that's just two differences. Okay. So you're taking the sums of squared. So okay, maybe this is the way to go. Look at this. Yeah. Okay. So previously we had this is going to look a bit weird. It doesn't really do this, but we have the low. So we have placebo, low, and high, and now. So this is implicitly the model is split between those three means, and now instead of those three means, what we're doing is we're doing contrast 1 and contrast 2. So what you're doing is you're just slicing up the variance differently, and that's what it does, and that's why you have those rules. Because if you don't follow those rules, it'll either expand too big, or and then it'll add bias into it, and so you might actually find a result when you shouldn't. Okay. Cool. Okay, we're going to move on to Ancova. Do we need to stand and stretch for a minute? Or we're feeling good to keep going? What there's muttering. Mutter louder. Keep going. Okay, we're going to go and then we'll take a break after these slides. Sorry? Everyone said break. Okay, we're going to do a 2-minute break. At 1:45 we'll go. We're going to break this up into small breaks, okay? 2 minutes, dance around, do whatever you need to. 2 minutes, go. Hello.
Regarding the article critique,
Yeah.
I took my classmates assignments.
Okay. Sorry?
I got the negative. The amount of negative.
Right. Okay. Did you say that you would show them this report?
No, but he's my friend.
Okay. So what's
Like it's like things were not appreciated. Like for example, product between someone two variables, satisfaction
yeah.
and empathy. Then he didn't mention that if it's between those two variables or any transformed variables like those two variables, or else.
We're recording right now. So it might not be audible. Let's talk about this after class. Yeah. What I will say is write your article critique in a way that gives both positive and negative comments, and that in such a way that it gives constructive criticism in a very polite, supportive way.
Yeah, I tried to make it so but the thing is, the amount of negatives were a bit considerable when compared to the wrong side. But marks were equal to positive.
You don't want to have equal, but I would say just to show your friends the thing. I mean, the better way to do these peer evaluations is to make it all anonymous and distribute it, but that's a ton of work. So you don't have to.
I just have to submit. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Just do it.
But
It's up to you. He gave permission, so you can always give a different version or just give verbal descriptions.
but there are some positives like the process and the presentation, so I mentioned there.
Yeah, these are decisions that you're gonna have to make.
Like I wanted to know, like
If you're not happy with it, right?
if there are more negatives
No, like just say how to improve. That's the big thing. Give actual feedback about what would you, if you wrote the report differently, what would you do? That's, make sure you do that and you'll be fine. Okay? I have no way of getting a good volume there. Okay, we're gonna do Ancova and then we're gonna take another short break. Sound good? I know this is the last marathon lecture that we have this term. We have another class next week, but it's gonna be a lot more chill, and hopefully we'll just go over how to study for the final exam, as well as talking a bit about ethics and generalization. Okay, so this is the crammed full lecture, and then next week we're gonna hopefully end. Right, that's how March is, right? You start like a lion, end like a lamb, or in this case, I guess we are ending like a lion. I'm going to stop rambling. Welcome to Ancova. Ancova is analysis of covariance. It's the same as ANOVA, but it has a predictor variable expected to be correlated to the output variable. And the way this looks is if you have your total variance in the data, and we create the model, and we explain that much variance, then there's error. But if we have a covariance, then that can be incorporated and it explains more of the variance, right? And then that reduces your sums of squared residual, and that really helps you understand what's going on. So, in this case, we suspect, again, this could be slightly problematic as an example, but I hope it's okay. We suspect that libido isn't fully explained by the predictor variable dose. There may be another factor, the libido of the participant's partner, right? So we're going to add that as a factor, right? So we've added a new variable. In this case, we have a full equation here where we have 3 betas with indicator variables. So the beta placebo, that's just going to be the intercept. Low dose and high dose, those have indicator variables. Is it low dose? Is it high? They're mutually exclusive. Error term. But we've added beta partner, P of I, and that's a continuous predictor variable. Okay? So here we have dummy variables. This is a covariate, so it's an integer value. So now we've got this. We've got libido and then partner libido, and that might help explain things. Good and tight. So we run these commands. We create them as factors. We create ourselves some contrast. We label as dose be no dose, high be low. And all we do is exactly the same command, analysis of variance. We have libido regressed on partner libido plus dose. Data equals the data that's provided. And then we do this command. ANOVA with a capital A, Viagra model.Ancova, type equals 3. This is a magic incantation that you do to do Ancova correctly. I'll explain why you do this, but it is actually critical. Okay? So we get this result. And what do we conclude from these results? Anyone? We see significant results in the intercept, but that's kind of like, okay, people score on the test. Partner libido has a significant value at P05, as does dose. So what we find is that the covariate is a significant predictor, so it has a link with the outcome. Usually we do that just to take away the error, but you can also conclude that there's an effect if you're interested in studying that. And then the dose is also significant, so we know that dose still has an effect. Okay. So basically just remove some more of that error, and it lets us study that as a potential variable if you'd like. But what are these magic type 3 tests? Has everyone heard of type 3 somewhere in the statistics background? Who has no idea what type is specified here? Yeah, that's overwhelming. Okay. This is actually a very important part, and if you take away one thing from this and the second half of this class today, is that you want to use type 3 sums of squares, okay? It's just one of those magic little things that you need to know, and I will almost certainly put this on the final exam. Okay? So, it's esoteric, but type 1, 2, 3 sums of squares, I think there's also type 4, but we're not going to get into it. It turns out there's multiple ways to calculate sums of squares. We thought it was easy. You just calculate the sums of squares from all these differences, right? But when you have these complex structures with complex means, now we have to calculate them in different ways and compensate for where they might overlap, okay? Type 1 is sequential. Order matters when you type things into your equation, right? In this case, partner libido goes before dose. And so that might be a different result than dose before libido. And I've never needed to know the order of that. That has never been part of my analysis. I never care to do it. You might someday maybe need to do this. Then you can use your type 1 order sums of squares. Second is sequential by interaction effects first. We'll get to this when we talk about interaction effects. Does anyone know what an interaction effect is when it comes to ANOVA? We will know about it in about a half hour, I hope. Type 3, no order effects, and this is the safest as default. So whenever I do an ANOVA, I always come back to this slide, or like the slide before it, and say, this is how I do type 3. Use type 3 sums of squared error. Very important. Just memorize that, okay? Yep.
When you say order, do you mean the order of the data or the order of the variables in the model?
Variables in the model, so the equation that you write. Yeah, good question. So if I did partner libido and then dose, or dose and partner libido, type 1 would have a different result. Type 2 doesn't matter here. I can't remember if it reduces to type 1 or type 3 in this case, but it will matter later. This is a really good explanation here, if you need to know. When in doubt, use type 3. Okay. So if you have robust Ancova, you can use trim means when assumptions are violated, and here's how you write it up. So basically, it's the same as ANOVA. You just throw in a predictor variable, same assumptions, and you can calculate eta squared and r as with ANOVA. But when you have multiple predictor variables, there's a different effect size, which is partial eta squared, as a way of saying the variance that a variable explains that is not explained by other variables in the model. So it's kind of like a unique explained variance, and that's a good effect size. In this case, we might want to calculate partial eta squared as a way to say how much of an effect Viagra has on libido. Okay, so you can calculate that. Details in the textbook. The covariate, partner's libido, was significantly related to the participant's libido, and then you have an F test, yeah. There's also a significant effect of the dose of Viagra on all levels of libido after controlling for the effect of the partner's libido. Boom. And so I think this should be partial eta squared, actually, not r up top. So I think that's a typo. Or actually, no, actually r might be the correlation coefficient. Yes, correlation coefficient and then partial eta squared. Yeah. Planned contrasts revealed that taking a high or low dose of Viagra significantly increased libido compared to taking a placebo. So you can still do your contrasts. All that does is take dose, the different levels of dose, and slice it up differently. Okay? There was no significant difference between the high and low doses of Viagra, and you have your t-test. There we go. So there is an activity associated with this. You can download it if you'd like. I will stop recording. We're going to take another 2 to 3 minute break.